Hello and welcome back to the 7th episode of my Fortnite tutorial series. After having completed both our stats and resource subsystem, we can finally work on the core of the system, which are the building manager, building classes and building widgets. So let's dive right into it. First off, if we have a look at how the building in Fortnite works, you will see that after you've selected a building, there is a semi-transparent blue version of the mesh you want to build that you can move around to see where the building would be placed. So we want to handle that effect using a different material than the mesh usually has. Let's go into our building system folder to materials and right click to create a new material. Let's call that m_ghost building. Then open it up. And if we have a look at all of the pins here, you will see that the opacity pin is grayed out because we would not be able to use that due to the blend mode of the material. However, I already said we want to create a blue translucent version of the material. So let's go to blend mode and make that translucent. Now opacity, emissive color and base color are appearing up here. And first off, we want to specify a color. So let's hold down 3 and left click to get a vector 3. Currently that's a constant. We want that to be a parameter so that later we can change that. Right click, convert to parameter, and the parameter name will just be color. Let's just leave the default value as black right now. Can change that later. Then grab the first gray pin here and move that onto your base color. Then we also want to have an emissive color. We could just plug in the color like we did for the base color. However, to boost that and to make it really shiny, we will multiply that. So look for multiply. Then we can hook that into the emissive color. And now we want to create a value that we can call something like the emissive boost that will hook up to B. So hold down 1 and left click, get a constant, plug that onto the B, right click and also convert that to parameter. And we will just call that something like emissiveness. Maybe give it a default of 2, something like that. Then there's only the opacity pin left, so we can copy the emissiveness, paste it, and then we can call that opacity. Here under the slider min and max, and opacity is always in the range of 0 to 1. Let's type in 1 as the maximum, and the default can be something like 0.5. Then let's hook that up to the opacity, apply and save the material. So now we've got something that looks about right. However, it's not blue yet and the emissive also doesn't work properly. But since we made all of that parameters, we can create something like a child of this material that are called material instances in which we can define these values. So let's close the m_ghost building, right click and create material instance. We'll call that mi for material instance _ghost building. Open it up and then we can enter the correct values in here. So first off, let's check the color. You have to check that little box here in order to be able to modify it. And now you can select something like a blue or light blue, whatever you want. I'll use a hex linear code again. If you want to get the exact same result, that will be in the video description. And the code here will be 003A7DFF. Hit OK. So also check emissiveness and opacity. I'll bump up the emissiveness to 2.5 and opacity to 0.6. These are just some values that worked well for me that I figured out experimenting. Feel free to use any other values that you can come up with. Then save it and close that material. Now we can go ahead and create our building classes. However, like for the resources, it would be good to have a structure that contains all of the important variables for a building. So let's go to blueprints, structure, right click and create a new structure. You can call that something like s_building data or info. Let's call that data and open it up. For every building, we first want to know about the name of the building. That's a text type called name. Hit the new variable button. Then we want every building to have a hotkey that can be used to build it. In this tutorial series, we won't deal with letting the player assign custom hotkeys to an action. So that's why the hotkey can be static and be defined in the building class. Usually you could set that up in completely different ways that would be more dynamic and allow for the player to change that. However, as I said, for this tutorial series, that's not our main focus. So the type here will just be a key. And let's call it hotkey. The last variable that we need is an icon. So let's call that icon. The type is a texture 2D. Object reference. Save and close the structure. Then let's head to our classes subfolder. And like with our resources, we want to have one master class that all of the other building classes inherit from. Let's create a new blueprint class of the type actor called BP_master_building. and open that up. First off, we know that every building has a mesh that represents the building, so we will add a component and look for static mesh component. Just call that building mesh, and we can enter something for the default value. Let's look for our wall mesh and select that. Then we've got the material here, and we can apply our mi_ghost building. And then there's also something very important, and that is the collision presets. Currently the collision is set to block all dynamic, but because by default the building will be in its ghost stage, so not built currently, just a preview basically, that has to be overlap all dynamic. Then let's add a variable, which will be the building data of the type of the structure we just created, so s_building data. And also you see in Fortnite that you can construct different buildings using various resources. So when we spawn a building, we've got to know about its resource. Let's hit the variable button once more, call that resource. And the type here will be a master resource class. Let's make that editable and expose on spawn. Compile and save this. We can head over to the event graph really quickly. And on begin play, we know that we've got to access our mi_ghost building, because there is a second reason why we made the color a parameter. That is that we can modify the color of the ghost building based on which resource is selected, just to indicate that. So we need dynamic access to that parameter. And in order to get that, you have to create a dynamic material instance variable. To do that, you just drag in your building mesh and off of it create dynamic material instance. Then it will be asking for a source material. To find that, just off of our building mesh, get material, element index is 0, and hook up the return value. Then our return value here needs to be a variable, so promote that. And let's call that something like dynamic material. We can also make that private. We don't need to access it from any other class, as well as the child classes. They also don't need access. Compile, save. That's it for now for the building class. Of course, we will return in a later episode, add more functionality to it. Let's close it. And let's create our 3 child classes. So right click, create child class. First one will be the building_wall, and let's open that up. We'll go to the class defaults, expand the building data. Name here will be wall. And basically it's the second construction you can build in Fortnite. And the keys I will use in this tutorial series are F6 to F8, because the other ones are used for editor stuff. So because this is the second one, it will be F7 as the key. And for the icon, let's just enter wall here. Select the icon_wall. That's from the texture pack. Close it. Right click our master building and create another child class. This will be the building_floor. Open that up. Name, of course, will be floor. It's the first building you can create, so F6 will be the key. And the icon, let's enter floor here. Icon_floor. Then we also have to update our building mesh here. Currently that's also a wall. So under static mesh, let's look for floor. Select that. And you see that it's offset. So we can fix that by going to the location and enter -400 in Y and 20 in Z to make that line up perfectly to the walls and stairs later. Compile, save, and let's create our last child class. So the building_stairs. Open that up. Name will be stairs. Hotkey F8. Icon will be icon_stair. And now we also need to update the building mesh. We haven't got an extra static mesh for stairs explicitly, but we can just use the wall and rotate that to make it look like stairs. Okay, to make it look like a stair, we'll just go to the rotation and enter something like -44 degree in X. However, we also need to scale it up now, because if you rotate that, it will not fit in our 400 by 400 by 400 grid later. So go to scale. X and Y can be left at 1 and Z can be something like 1.43. Again, that's just a value I found out experimenting with it. No real science behind that. And also I figured out later that to make it fit in the grid perfectly, we need a bit of an offset. So location in Y will be 7 and in Z it will be -7.2. Compile, save. That's it for all of our building child classes. In this episode, we also want to set up the building widget. So let's have a quick look at how that's done in Fortnite. You will see that first off, on the upper side of the widget, you've got a border with the hotkey used for the building. There is a bit of empty space, and beneath that, you see something like a transparent blue background with the building icon on top of it. To recreate that, let's go to widgets, create a new widget blueprint, call it w_building, and let's open that up. Again, this will be a widget that is nested inside other widgets, so our setting here has to be desired on screen. And like we did with all of our other widgets, we start with a size box. Check width and height override, and the values I found out that we're working properly are 89 pixels in width by 128 for height. I already mentioned that the elements in the widget are aligned from top to bottom, so what we need is a vertical box. And in there we start with the hotkey, so let's add a size box. Width and height override will be 28 by 28. And then we will align that to the center horizontally and vertically to the top. In there you see a border and then the text of the actual hotkey. So to place these individual elements on top of each other, we will use an overlay. Add that onto the size box, and let's start with an image. This will be static, so let's uncheck its variable, and the image here will be our hotkey border. Then let's look for a text, drag that onto the overlay. And that one we can call hotkey text, and it needs to be a variable. As a default, let's type in something like F1. Let's scale the size down to 15, align to the center in both dimensions. And to make it stand out a little bit more, there are two things we'll do. First off, go to the shadow color and bump up the alpha to 1. Then go to our hotkey and set the alpha to 0.7. And you'll see that our hotkey text isn't perfectly in the middle here. So let's go to padding and fix it. We'll use a padding of 2 to the top and maybe 1 to the left. That looks more like it's in the center now. To add the empty space, we will use a spacer. Drag that onto the vertical box. And actually, that spacer will be a variable. Let's just call it icon spacer or something. Because we will reduce the empty space between hotkey and actual icon when a particular widget is selected. So that has to be a variable, and in Y we'll add a default of 10 pixel maybe. Grab another size box, add that onto the vertical box. Width and height override of 89 by 89. Let's align that to the center horizontally and vertically to the top. In there, let's grab a border, drag that onto the size box, call that something like building border. And we'll make that a variable. Content padding will be 0. Then go to the brush, and under image we will select the building_bg, so that blue gradient here. Now we could just grab an image, paste that onto our building border and make that the icon. However, something you see in Fortnite is when a building is selected, there is something like a white outline around the building border that we created here. So to be able to also show that, we will grab an overlay onto the border, and first off start with another size box that's used for the icon this time. Give it a width and height override of, let's say, 80 by 80 pixel, and align that to the center in both dimensions. Then let's grab an image and let's call this the icon. Make sure it's a variable. Default image can be something like our floor icon, really doesn't matter. And then to create that outline, we will grab another image, drag that onto the overlay, and we'll just call that one outline. Make sure it's a variable. We will align that to fill in both dimensions, and under image, look for the building_border. Right, so that white outline here. However, we only want to show that when something is selected, so by default the visibility will be hidden. If you change that, you won't see any updates in your little preview here. If you also want to hide it in the preview, you will go to your hierarchy, to the outline, and hit that little eye icon, so the widget's editor visibility. Alright, compile and save, and let's add some functionality in the graph. First off, we need some variables. I already told you that there's always one building that's selected currently, so let's add a boolean called selected ? Then add another variable, which will be the actual building that this widget represents, and that will be a master building class reference. Make that editable and expose on spawn. We want to know about which building it is when we create this widget. Compile and save. Go to the selected, and the default value will be true. I'll explain in a moment why we want to check that. In here we only need one function. that's called select building, which needs one input of type boolean called select. And first off, add a branch to see whether the select input is not equal to the selected variable. Because if they are equal, there is no point in selecting the building. So for false, you just add a return node. If it's true, however, we will set selected to the input boolean and then also update the widget display. For example, I told you that we will show the outline in this case. So grab your outline and set visibility. Of course, the invisibility will change based on the value of selected. So grab selected and add a select node. Then if we drag the return value onto the invisibility, you get the opportunity to select two values. If selected is true, it will be self-hit test invisible. If false, it will just be hidden. And the second visual update will be the icon spacer here. Told you that we will reduce the empty space if a widget is selected, so grab your icon spacer and call the function setSize. It will be asking you to select an in size. We only want to control the y value, so let's split the struct ban. X will always be 1 and the in size in y will change again based on the selected. So let's add another select node. Return value goes into the in size y. If selected is false, that will be the default value of, I think it was 10 pixel. And if it's true, let's maybe use the half, so 5. After that, we can return. Compile save, that's the only function we need in here. Let's head over to the event graph, event construct, don't need the other two events. And here we will grab the hotkey text and set text, so it actually reads the assigned hotkey. And to grab the text that goes in here, we get the building, get class defaults, grab the building data and break it. And then we need the hotkey and call the function by the name getKeyDisplayName. Then plug the return value into the in text. Also update our icon. So set brush from texture. Texture will come from our icon here. Let's check match size. And then we will call select building with the input being false. And now it makes sense that our default value of selected is true, because by that it's able to pass the first branch here and just do the little cosmetic updates that the outline will be hidden and the icon spacer will be set up properly. Like in one of our other widgets, I think it was the w_resource, it could be that based on your performance you actually see it updating. So to prevent that, at the very end we will set visibility of ourselves to self-hit test, so show that widget, and go to the designer, select the w_building right here in the hierarchy, and the visibility will be hidden by default. Compile and save. And that's it for our w_building. We can close it. Before we actually integrate that in our main widget, let's go ahead and already create our building manager. So blueprints, classes, new blueprint class of the type actor component. That will call bpc_building manager. We don't need a master class in here because the only one that's able to actually use a building manager is the player. So no need for parent and child classes. Open it up and add a couple of variables. First off, we need a list of the buildings that the player can build. So call that buildings. Variable type will be a master building class and the type will be array. Make that editable and expose. Compile, and already let's add the 3 default elements to it, so we don't have to do that in our player class. Element 0 will be the floor, then there will be the wall, and finally the stairs. Let's add another variable, which will be a reference to the player character. Variable type, third person character reference, and it will be a single variable. Let's make that a private one. We only need access to that in here. Let's add another one called initialized question mark of the type boolean. That will also only be used internally, so let's make that private. Then there will be the building widgets that we need access to in order to update them. And the type here will be w_building object reference, and it will be an array. Let's also make that private. And finally the selected building index. Variable type will be integer, a single variable, and also private. Path save. We will return to that class in a moment. For now, we can simply minimize it and head over to our main widget. In here, we need a container for all of our building widgets. In Fortnite, these are aligned horizontally, so we will also use a horizontal box. Drag that in, make that a variable, call it something like buildings box, and let's anchor that to the right center one. Give it an alignment of 1 in X and 0 in Y, and then we can set the position to something like -20 in X and 200 in Y. Then bump up the size in X to 287. So basically that's the size of 3 of our building widgets plus 10 pixels offset to the second and third widget like we did in our resources. And the size in Y will be 128, which is equal to the size in Y of the building widget. Now we need to dynamically generate those widgets. So let's go to the graph and let's add a variable here called building widgets of the variable type w_building object reference, and let's make that an array. Now that will be very similar to the generate resource widgets function. So we can simply duplicate it and call it generate building widget. Of course, we need to make some modifications to that. First off, our input here will be called manager, but it will be a building manager object reference, and the created widgets will be of type w_building object reference. You will see that our changes broke some things in here, which is fine because we don't want to get resources, we want to get the buildings, our classes array, and remove these two nodes. Then we can grab another for each loop, plug in that array and hook up the execution. Then we can remove the other one. Completed will go into our return node, and we don't want to return our resource widgets but the building widgets. Then plug in the array index for the greater condition, and we don't want to create a resource widget but a building widget in here. Then hook up the array element to building, hook up the loop body. We don't want to add it to the resource widgets array but to the building widgets. Call the add function, remove that one and plug in the return value. Then again, let's replace the resource box by the buildings box. You can just drag and drop that onto the resource box and it will read change node to read buildings box. So that's perfect. And the padding left will be the same one. We will use 10 for every element that has an index that's greater than 0. That function is all we need in here. We can compile, save, close the main widget and return to our building manager. Remove the default events and add a custom event called initialize that needs one input, called player of the type third person character reference. Like in our other managers, we want to check whether that input here is valid, and if so, set the player character to that input, then hook everything up. Also set initialized to true, then get our player character, get the main widget and call the generate building widgets function. It will be asking for the manager, which is just self, and the created widgets will feed into our building widgets variable. For now, that's enough for our initialize event and for the building manager itself. So compile, save, close it, and we also need to attach that to our third person character. So let's add a component called building manager, and on event begin play, we are initializing our two other managers, and before we add our main widget to the viewport, we grab our building manager and initialize that with the player being a reference to ourselves. Then connect that to the execution, and after it add to viewport. Another thing that's done in Fortnite is that the size and opacity of all of the building widgets is reduced when you're not in construction mode. To recreate that, it's very simple with our update state display function. Let's go in there, and right before we go into the switch node, we will add some empty space. Then off of the main widget, get the buildings box, and first off we want to set render opacity. Of course, the value here will change based on the state, so you can copy over our state and select, then move your return value onto the inopacity. If we're in construction state, the alpha will be 1 or the opacity will be 1, and in combat that will be 0.8, maybe 80%. Then let's also modify the size of that building box. So let's search for set render scale. And after we set the render scale, we want to go into the switch node. Again, we want to select, right click the return value. We want to change the pin type to a float. And then off of it, we can make vector 2D and connect it to X and Y because we want to use uniform scaling. Then plug the return value into the scale. If we're in construction mode, that will be 1 in X and Y, and if not, 0.8. Alright, that should be it for now. Let's see whether that actually works. Okay, now I'm in play mode. Currently we're in combat mode. We also see that our building widgets were created properly for F6, F7 and an 8 with the proper icons. Currently they are pretty small. If we hit Q, the size of the widgets bumps up and also the opacity increases. Here's the comparison. So that's working perfectly, and that's it for this episode. In the next one, we will expand the functionality of our building manager so that we can actually select buildings and also place them in our world and make them line up perfectly using an invisible grid. So see you then.